On Monday, May 25th, our world and our lives began to change permanently as the videos of the murder of George Floyd at the hand of the Minneapolis police went viral. People watched from their cell phones and laptops in horror as the life was squeezed out of Floyd's body, with his police executioner Derek Chauvin keeping his knee pinned to Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as Floyd cried out in desperation. In the 12 days since his murder, we have seen a massive response across the country and in other parts of the world. People of all ages, races, and ethnicities have responded to the situation, saying no more and demanding justice for George Floyd. For many, the death of Floyd was the last straw. People are not only responding to the racist police terror that killed Floyd, though. Their response is also fueled by the crippling economic and public health situation that the ruling class has allowed to happen with COVID-19, where their total lack of an effective response has led to the unnecessary death of tens of thousands and mass unemployment. Due to the power and depth of the protests, the authorities in Minnesota were forced to change the charges against Derek Chauvin to second-degree murder, while also forcing them to arrest and charge the other 3 cops who helped carry out the murder. In addition, the response has led to all sorts of promises being made by politicians and police departments across the country, claiming they will reform their department or reduce funding to the police. Anti-lynching legislation has even been proposed in Congress as another symbolic gesture. But now that the 4 cops have been charged and they are promising new laws and training for their cops, can we really expect a change to their priorities or to the functioning of their society? To answer that question, we should look at how we got here and their response to this uprising. The brutal execution of George Floyd is not an exception, but rather a permanent feature of this society, which is based on oppressing working and poor people. In this society, which is based on massive economic and racial inequality, Black people are subjected to this violence on all fronts. This means the violence of police brutality, where 1 in 1,000 African American men will be killed in this country at the hands of the police over their lifetime. This means the violence of poverty, where 1 in 4 African Americans are living under the federal poverty line. And now, this situation has gotten even worse with the shutting down of the economy. Right now, it is estimated that half of working-age Black adults in the United States are unemployed. This violence is not the result of a broken system. It's how the system functions. And when people across the country have protested against these various forms of violence, we have seen the militarized response that they are willing to use to enforce their system. These forces of repression are their tools to maintain their system and to intimidate the population into submission. Their actions show they have no intention to change, no remorse for their actions whatsoever, and will use force to back up their rule at all costs. We saw the same priorities and values of this system in their response to the COVID-19 crisis. Their wait-and-see approach towards our public health system, which prioritized the profits of corporations and banks instead of the well-being of the population, has led to more than 109,000 deaths in this country as of today. Because of their inaction and because of their negligence, those in power are complicit in the murder of tens of thousands of people. Their lack of concern has also led to a massive economic crisis for us, with unprecedented levels of unemployment that will last for years to come. Wall Street economists estimate that as many as 40% of the current coronavirus layoffs will be permanent. While we face this economic suffering, things could hardly be better for them. While more than 43 million workers have been forced to file for meager unemployment benefits since the start of the virus, often waiting months for payments depending on what state you live in, the collective wealth of the nation's billionaires has increased by over $400 billion. This amount of wealth is so unbelievable you can't even wrap your head around it. With all the attention in the media about looting the past week, it's about time we called out the real looters of the wealth in this society, which is the 1%. Despite this cash frenzy for the rich, where they received handouts of literally trillions of dollars from the federal government, they are crying broke and are accelerating their drive to reopen the economy. They are forcing workers back to work to restore their profits. This has been the case in industries such as meatpacking, where they have shown that they don't even care if workers or their families get sick and die in the process. In these economic conditions, we can expect the bosses to push to rely on fewer workers to do more work to save money. This will mean a drive toward longer workdays and the speeding up of work, all aimed at squeezing as much out of workers as possible. At the vast majority of workplaces, this will be the model that bosses impose on workers as the economy is reopened. This is the reality of the situation we face. But the murder of George Floyd has brought people together in a way that most of us haven't seen in our lifetimes. The system stands exposed for all to see. We can see clearly the values and priorities of this system and what their plans are for us if we allow them to go through with it. But this fight is not over. In fact, it's just beginning. Coronavirus is still ravaging the global population. Police brutality isn't ending. We've just seen the cops just murdered a 22-year-old man, Sean Monterosa, in Vallejo, here in the Bay Area on Tuesday night. He was outside a Walgreens that was allegedly being looted. He saw the cops and dropped to his knees with his hands up to surrender. But they shot him anyways, 5 times, claiming they thought a hammer that he had in his back pocket was a gun. There are less violent attacks in store for millions when the moratoriums on evictions end and we have several months of rent to pay back. What about when mortgages start to come due, when credit card penalties start rolling in, and when people are forced to return to work without any real safety precautions? These are the plans they have in store for us. But we can't allow this system to weigh on each of us individually. We need to find ways to strengthen the bonds that have begun to be built. With each additional assault on our lives, there is potential for more to join our ranks. We see their plans for us. It's time for us to make our own plans in response.
We have seen the utter disregard for human life by those in power. First, by their deadly mismanagement of the pandemic crisis. And now this racist system is exposed once again with the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the police. But what we have also seen is how working people and young people all over the country and the world have responded with relentless energy. Healthcare workers all over the country have participated in demonstrations against police brutality, either by marching or by caring for people who have been either tear gassed or attacked by the police. Many have organized their own demonstrations, like the Portland healthcare workers who organized a kneeling down demonstration, and the Kaiser Oakland doctors who organized a walkout of healthcare workers just this past Wednesday. Healthcare workers have numerous times cheered protesters as they march by their hospitals. But having to respond to the injustices of this system is not something new to those who work in healthcare. For months prior to the events in Minneapolis, healthcare workers all over the world have been protesting their dangerous working conditions. In Germany, for example, workers demonstrated against the poor response to the pandemic, but also against the already deficient healthcare system. In the Ukraine, workers rallied to protest a pay cut in the time of pandemic. In Mexico, demonstrations were held to demand access to PPE after the death of a healthcare worker. And here in the United States, healthcare workers have demonstrated at hospitals, including San Francisco and Oakland. And this story repeats itself all over the world. This response comes after healthcare workers, as essential frontline workers, have faced months of deadly working conditions and unnecessary death. Healthcare workers account for 11% of the COVID-19 infection cases in the United States. Throughout this crisis, healthcare workers have often been forced to work in unsafe conditions. Some have had to wear makeshift PPE, such as trash bags, and some have even been reprimanded for bringing their own masks from home. Whistleblowers have been fired for denouncing dangerous working conditions and the mistreatment of patients. And now there are also healthcare workers that are being furloughed or laid off. Many healthcare workers have worked nonstop throughout this crisis. Some have had to find alternative housing options to avoid infecting their families and loved ones. Many who lack childcare are just forced to endanger their children. Because of the pressures, witnessing so much intense suffering and death, many healthcare workers are demonstrating signs of PTSD. A healthcare system that cares so little for workers cannot provide proper care to others. Look at the numbers. The United States leads in the number of deaths due to COVID-19. 1/3 of the deaths in the United States are nursing home residents. Black and Latino people and Native Americans have a higher likelihood of contracting the virus and of dying from it. Those in prisons and in immigration detention centers are at high risk. This is a story that also we see repeated all over the world. Without the efforts of healthcare workers to speak up and demand what we need, nothing would have changed. We need to continue to be active and vigilant, especially now that hospitals and clinics are planning to fully reopen. We know what is necessary to protect our health and to fight for our lives and to fight for the lives of our patients. And we know that we have to organize and insist that safety measures are taken to protect our lives and the lives of our patients. As healthcare workers, we are truly on the front lines of the violence of this system. Imagine what it felt like to be the paramedics who tried to resuscitate George Floyd. Very much like those first responders, healthcare workers find themselves responding to the attacks of the capitalist system every day. But this time, we, like so many others, are not going to let this continue without voicing our anger. Healthcare workers can and should help to lead the fight for a healthy society, whether that means free, comprehensive, and available healthcare for everyone, or whether it is the fight to get rid of the cancer of racism and the exploitation, oppression, and systematic violence of a society that's run by the 1%. If we want our conditions to change, if we want to cure the ills of this society, healthcare workers and other workers will have to join together and take matters into our own hands.
Here we are again, dealing with the aftermath of another string of Black people that have been murdered by thugs in badges. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, just two names in a seemingly endless list of many, all reduced to hashtags. And as usual, the media spent more time criminalizing the protesters than they did addressing the murders that triggered the protests to begin with. And in the midst of all this, I'm expected to put on my bus operator uniform when I know that police view and treat me differently while wearing it. I want them to know that I have chosen a side, and it's not theirs. The roar of the crowd screaming "no justice, no peace" is music to my ears. We are finding ourselves in the middle of multiple public health crises at the same time. Policing and racism on top of the COVID-19 pandemic. And being a bus operator was difficult before the pandemic hit. A typical day meant dealing with terrible traffic, cars cutting you off left and right, passengers who can't or won't pay the fare, schedules that are impossible to stay on, long hours, missed breaks, and too many threats to your personal safety to count. Saying that COVID-19 made a challenging job tougher is an understatement. While doctors, news anchors, and politicians were telling everyone to stay home and stay away from people as much as possible, I was expected to pull into crowded bus stops, open my doors, and have passengers stand a foot away from me while paying their fare. Thankfully, quite a few of us operators took it upon ourselves to ask passengers to board from the rear doors only and skip paying the fare altogether. It was just good common sense as far as I was concerned, and the least I could do to protect both my passengers and myself. After days of us reaching out to management and pressure from our union, management released a memo with new policies to quote unquote keep us safe. Rear door boarding, as well as free rides, became the standard, as well as blocking off the front of the bus to keep passengers at least 6 feet away from bus operators. I later found out that bus operators were already blocking off their buses. So all these safety measures came from workers that were unwilling to work in unsafe conditions while waiting on management to act. The fight didn't stop there. we were still expected to pack the back of those buses, despite the executive order from our governor banning crowds of 10 or more. After a few more days of many of us flat out refusing to carry more than 10 people in such a small space, management officially changed that policy too. I would love to tell you that it was smooth sailing after that, but I would be lying. A month ago, a drunk passenger broke through the makeshift barrier on my bus and spit on me. So when people talk about reopening the economy and getting back to normal, it makes me extremely angry. And if I'm being honest, more than a little scared. I've already seen the proof that we can't depend on the government or our managers to make our health and safety a priority. They're so ready to go back to collecting fare, no matter how unsafe it is for both transit workers and passengers. Why should we go back to that? Risking our health for a few bucks per person. We pay taxes for everything else. Why not include the cost of transit rides and make the bus free for all? Honestly, I've always felt like this. Let's eliminate these awkward moments in which passengers try to explain to me why they don't have the fare. The fact that they think they owe me that is infuriating. I don't turn passengers away because they don't have money, because it's not my job to punish people simply because the people they work for don't value them enough to pay them a living wage. Interestingly enough, the chaos and danger of the pandemic seems to have served as a catalyst for transit workers to come together and fight for the protection we deserve as essential workers. In April, a few of us started meeting on Zoom to discuss the conditions at work. Our group has grown significantly, and we're currently fighting for things like safe and clean restroom facilities throughout the system, personal protective equipment to be provided daily for all workers, more staff and resources to clean buses multiple times daily, real protective barriers to prevent operator assaults, more buses on the road to prevent overcrowding and operator fatigue due to missed breaks. So far, we put together a petition that got over 200 signatures in just 48 hours. And right now, we actually have a petition out that has nearly 100 signatures and counting. I think that many voices are impossible to ignore. On and off the job, we're finding ways to take our power back. I stand with the bus operators in New York and Minneapolis, the ones who refuse to transport protesters to jail for the police. I refuse to be a cog in the wheel of oppression.
Now that we've heard from a bus operator and a healthcare worker, I want to talk to you about what it means to be a teacher, watching as the future is stolen from young people. What does that look like in our school system? Oakland Unified School District has its own police force, as well as a large contingent of school security officers on most campuses. In 2011, OUSD police killed Raheem Brown in a hail of bullets outside of a school dance, where he was sitting in a car eating fast food with a friend. As he bled to death, he cried out to his friend, "Help me, sis." Schools in poor and working class neighborhoods are neglected, class sizes are large, and black children are disproportionately punished and expelled. There's just one nurse for every 1,300 students and one counselor for every 550. If that's not a knee to the neck, then I don't know what is. And keep in mind, these were the conditions before the pandemic. Students and families have been hit incredibly hard by this catastrophe. Many families are employed, unemployed, running out of food, and can't pay their bills. While teachers supposedly conducted online classes for students, the Oakland School District acknowledged that nearly 30% of students didn't even have access to a computer. At my school, we were able to distribute laptops to every single student, and it was a completely insufficient effort because most students didn't have Wi-Fi access, a story that was repeated again and again across the country. After all, if your family is on the verge of hunger and bankruptcy, the last thing you're going to do is pay $75 a month for internet access. There are countless teachers, counselors, attendance clerks, cafeteria staff, and custodians who have stepped up in this situation. Many education workers have personally delivered cash and food to students and families in a desperate effort to keep them afloat. These efforts are incredibly important and should be acknowledged, but they are not enough given the systemic nature of the problems we face. As the renowned Black poet Langston Hughes once observed in Kids Who Die, the old and the rich will live on a while, as always, eating blood and gold, letting kids die. Although the poem was written in 1938, it might as well describe 2020. Their system is robbing young people's future before our very eyes. Young people are right to take to the streets and to refuse to go home. After all, this is the generation that has lived through the 2008 recession, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the never-ending military occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, the Black Lives Matter movement, and now, a global pandemic. And this is where we begin to see the impact that social movements can have on collective consciousness. The Ferguson uprisings in 2014 and the Black Lives Matter movement did not solve the problem of police brutality. But consider this. When Michael Brown was slaughtered on the streets of Ferguson, his body left to sear in the hot sun for 4 hours, just 43% of Americans saw his execution as a sign of broader problems in how police treat African Americans. Now, after the murder of George Floyd, that figure stands at 74%. In a recent Reuters poll, 64% of the people interviewed were sympathetic to the protests. A social movement changes minds collectively as people go through an experience together, see their collective strength and power, and learn to rely on themselves. We've seen that right here in the city of Oakland, as 2 young activists responded to the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery. They had never planned to march or lead a rally in their lives, but they decided something needed to be done and that they were the ones to do it. And what happened? After they posted widely on social media, 15,000 people showed up. The attitude of these 2 young men has been replicated across the world, and it shows that people realize that the changes they want to see are on them. That's what we've seen for the last 10 days. The marches and the rallies have corresponded to what people want to do. They want to come together, they want to be connected, and they want to oppose the racist violence of this society. This pattern has been repeated across the world. While capitalism offers us a bleak future, the global protests offer us hope. Here's a Facebook post from Lubec, a tiny fishing village of 1,500 people in Maine. Tomorrow, June 1st, will mark 1 week since the murder of George Floyd. While we are a small community, we still deserve to be heard and to help spread awareness. At 8 p.m. at the dock, I will park my car and leave my headlights on for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to symbolize the time Derek Chauvin had his knee on George's neck, all while George was telling him that he couldn't breathe and begging for his life. If you believe that Black Lives Matter, please join me in memory of George Floyd and the countless others who have been murdered in this country for nothing more than the color of their skin. Thank you, the post ended. It sparked similar actions in 2 other tiny fishing towns, so the cars that gathered flashed their headlights at each other across the bay. It's also incredibly important to acknowledge the international scope of the protests. In Syria, a country that has been torn apart during a long civil war, Aziz Asmar painted a mural of George Floyd on the rubble of a bombed-out building. He said, "I decided to paint George Floyd to send a message to the world that despite the international negligence and blindness of the killing of civilians in Syria over a period of 10 years, we have a humanitarian duty to sympathize with all the oppressed in the world. Because we are advocates of peace, we hope that racism and crime will disappear and that the world will enjoy happiness." In Paris, one protester told the police who stopped to check his ID, "You can find me 10,000 or 20,000 times. The revolt will happen anyway." In Australia, where Indigenous Australians are 3% of the population. They make up 27% of the prison population. One protester held a sign that said, "Same story, different soil." Another protester told a reporter, "If we don't die from the pandemic, then we'll die from police brutality." Around the world, protesters have gathered on every continent but Antarctica. From Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Tehran to Tokyo, from Calcutta to Kingston, from Johannesburg to Jerusalem, from Rome to Rio de Janeiro, and countless other cities. The signs at these protests said things like, "Black Lives Matter," "We can't breathe," "Enough is enough," "No justice, no peace," "Nobody's free until everybody's free," Ayotzinapa, Minneapolis, and Palestine. My neighborhood, your neighborhood, our neighborhood. And in Palestine, protesters placed a picture of George Floyd side by side with the Yad al-Halak, a Palestinian who was murdered by the Israeli police. The words were simple: "Our struggles are one." These protests represent a huge cross-section of society, and many of the participants are people who have never been active before. The demonstrations have been multiracial, and although young people have stepped up in droves, it was a 75-year-old man in Buffalo that was knocked down to the ground by police. There have been marches and rallies in more than 700 cities and towns in the United States, and in every single state. Protesters aren't just talking about racist police killings. They have put the issue of systemic racism front and center because it is a systemic problem, not a one-off event. And most importantly, they're refusing to accept things and just go home. And they're refusing to trust the authorities and the politicians to take care of things and act in their name. They are absolutely right to do so. We can't put our hopes in a police review board, better training, or body cams. The purpose of the police is not the protection of public safety. It's the maintenance of the existing social order and the protection of the interests of the 1%. We cannot afford to waste our time putting our faith in replacing one set of politicians with another, or in the passage of another set of laws. On the 12th day of the protests, the Democrats and the nonprofits have come out in full force to rechannel our energies into just waiting for the ballot box in November. That's a dead end, one that we've seen all too many times under this system. It's what the politicians did during the labor movement in the 1930s, and it's what they did once again during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Instead, we have to continue to put our hope in ourselves, in our own forces, and we have every reason to do so. Look at what just 12 days of demonstrations have accomplished. The large-scale protests are the reason the police in Minneapolis got charged in 4 days. They're the reason the police officers in Louisville were fired. They're the reason the police officers in Buffalo were suspended. And they're the reason the mayor of LA has proposed a $150 million budget cut to the police. While these are victories worth celebrating, we can't be satisfied with stopping here. As we've already seen, the politicians are waiting in the wings with countless proposals for more oversight committees, more civilian review boards, and better training. This is all in order to protect their system and to keep it intact. The system of the 1%, the system of institutionalized racism, the system of climate change, and the system of violence and endless war. And that's where we must choose a different way forward. While opportunists are all too willing to channel the energy and enthusiasm of protesters into reforms, we should remember the words of Zoe Schaefer, a young protester in Minneapolis. Asked by a reporter if she was satisfied that the other 3 cops were charged in George Floyd's murder, she said, "I won't be satisfied until I can wake up and have kids and have them not fear for their lives just for being Black. It's not enough. It's not enough until everything changes." People won't stay out in the streets indefinitely, but that doesn't mean the fight will be over. What the protests have begun to show us is that we have the possibility to change everything and to fight for the total transformation of this society. And as new fights emerge and intersect with the protests against the racist police murders of Black folks, we'll have a new level of collective consciousness and a new way of seeing the world. Think about what that means when they try to evict tens of millions of people from our homes for non-payment of rent or mortgages. when they try to demand that workers go back to work in unsafe working conditions and accept wages and pay cuts, when they try to enact billions of dollars in budget cuts, and when they try to further privatize public services, all while leaving a brutal racist policing system completely intact. We've heard today from workers in public transit, healthcare, and education. Up to this point, we've waged separate fights, isolated from one another. Teachers have staged a multi-year strike wave from West Virginia to Arizona. Thousands of healthcare workers around the world have demonstrated for the health and safety of us all, demanding PPE and the resources they need to fight COVID. Public transit workers have stopped collecting fares from passengers, have staged one-day safety strikes, and have refused to transport protesters to local jails. These efforts raise important questions. Instead of waging these struggles apart from one another, what if we combined our forces and fought alongside each other for a different future? What might happen if we build our own organizations instead of relying on the politicians and the nonprofits to lead the way? That's the kind of social movement we need to build, a grassroots movement that doesn't depend on politicians or union officials or nonprofit executives, but on ourselves. We're already connected to each other in our workplaces and in our neighborhoods. That means we have the power not just to resist, but to take charge of our future. The pandemic and the phrase essential workers have revealed now, more than ever, who is really needed to make this entire system run. After all, it's the healthcare workers who treat the COVID patients and who disinfect the hospitals. It's bus operators that transport passengers, warehouse workers that load and ship the goods we order, grocery store workers that ensure we have access to food, and farm workers that harvest the crops we eat. If working people do all the work to make their entire system run, it also means we have the ability to refuse to keep this system going and instead fight to completely transform our world. As we make that fight, let's keep Zoe's words in mind. It's not enough until everything changes.